political structures and economic systems ultimately exist to shape how people live their daily lives. Understanding what Europe would have been like under permanent Nazi control requires examining not just grand strategies and administrative structures, but the quotidian realities people would have faced. How would ordinary people have lived, worked, eaten, been educated, and experienced culture under permanent German occupation? The answer emerges from examining actual conditions in occupied territories during the war, Nazi planning documents about post-war organization, and the ideological principles that drove Nazi social policy. What becomes clear is that daily life would have varied dramatically based on where you lived and who you were in the Nazi racial hierarchy. For some, life would have been bearable if constrained. For others, it would have been a daily struggle for survival. For many, it would have meant early death. The ration system and daily hunger. Food dominated daily concerns in occupied Europe during the war, and it would have continued to dominate under permanent occupation. The Nazi ration system, implemented across occupied territories, provides clear insight into how daily nutrition would have been controlled and distributed according to racial and political criteria. Ration systems weren't new to wartime Europe. Most combatant nations implemented rationing to ensure fair distribution of scarce resources. What made the Nazi system distinctive was its deliberate use of food as a tool of racial policy and population control. Rations weren't distributed equally. They were allocated according to Nazi racial hierarchies and political loyalties. Germans received the highest rations, typically around 2,400 to 2,500 calories per day during the war. This was sufficient for adequate nutrition, though below peacetime consumption levels. German rations included meat, fats, dairy products, and bread in quantities that maintained health and working capacity. Under a victory scenario, German rations would likely have returned to pre-war abundance as resources from occupied territories flowed to Germany. Western Europeans in territories like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands received significantly lower rations, typically 1,300 to 1,800 calories per day depending on the specific territory and time period. This was barely sufficient for survival, particularly for people performing physical labor. Rations at this level meant chronic hunger, weight loss, and increased susceptibility to disease. The composition of rations mattered as much as caloric content. Western European rations consisted heavily of bread and potatoes with minimal protein and fats. Meat was rare, appearing perhaps once a week in small quantities. Dairy products were scarce. Fresh vegetables and fruits were limited. This diet could sustain life, but not health, particularly over years. Eastern Europeans and Soviet populations faced catastrophically inadequate rations. Official rations for these populations were often set at 600 to 900 calories per day, well below subsistence level. Nazi policy explicitly aimed to reduce these populations through controlled starvation. The rations provided weren't intended to sustain life indefinitely, merely to extract labor before the population declined through malnutrition and disease. Jews in ghettos and camps received even lower rations, often 200 to 400 calories per day. This wasn't rationing. It was slow-motion murder through starvation. Under a victory scenario, the Jewish population would have been eliminated through the Holocaust, but other groups deemed undesirable would have faced similar starvation policies. The black market became essential for survival in occupied territories. Official rations were insufficient, so people supplemented through illegal trading, foraging, and growing food in whatever space available. German authorities knew about black market activity and sometimes tolerated it as a safety valve that prevented complete social collapse. However, penalties for black market activity could be severe, including imprisonment or deportation to labor camps. Urban populations suffered more than rural ones under rationing. Rural people could supplement rations through farming, hunting, and foraging. Urban populations, completely dependent on official distribution, faced severe malnutrition. Cities in occupied territories saw dramatic increases in diseases associated with malnutrition, including tuberculosis, rickets, and vitamin deficiency conditions. Children suffered particularly severely. Inadequate nutrition during developmental years caused stunted growth, cognitive impairment, and weakened immune systems. An entire generation in occupied territories would have grown up malnourished, with lifelong health consequences. School performance declined as hungry children couldn't concentrate. Infant mortality increased as pregnant women lacked adequate nutrition. The psychological impact of chronic hunger affected daily life profoundly. Constant preoccupation with obtaining food dominated thoughts and conversation. Social relationships were strained by competition for scarce resources. The black market created opportunities for corruption and exploitation. Hunger undermined resistance by making people desperate and focused on immediate survival rather than long-term political action. Housing and living conditions. Housing conditions deteriorated across occupied Europe during the war and would have remained poor under permanent occupation. Nazi policies toward housing varied by territory, but generally involved requisitioning the best housing for German use, while leaving occupied populations in increasingly crowded and deteriorating conditions. In Western European cities, German military and civilian authorities seized the best residences for their own use. Local populations were compressed into remaining housing stock, creating overcrowding. Families that previously had entire apartments found themselves sharing space with other families. Privacy became a luxury few could afford. Maintenance and repair of housing declined due to material shortages and the diversion of construction resources to German priorities. Buildings deteriorated. Plumbing failed. Heating systems broke down. In the harsh European winters, inadequate heating combined with malnutrition made life miserable and increased mortality, particularly among the elderly and very young. Eastern European housing conditions were far worse. Nazi plans for the East envisioned most of the Slavic population living in barrack-style accommodations or rural settlements with minimal infrastructure. Urban housing would be demolished or seized for German colonists. The remaining population would be housed in whatever structures were expedient, with no concern for comfort or dignity. The general plan Ost specifically called for reducing eastern populations to a primitive agricultural existence. Housing for these populations would be minimal, perhaps wooden barracks or simple cottages without modern amenities. No indoor plumbing, no electricity, no heating beyond wood stoves. Living conditions would resemble those of the poorest rural areas of the 19th century. German colonists in the East, by contrast, would receive modern housing built to German standards. Nazi architectural plans showed Germanic-style houses with all modern conveniences, landscaped yards, and community facilities. The contrast between German and Slavic housing would be stark and deliberate, a physical manifestation of Nazi racial hierarchy. Homelessness increased in occupied territories due to war damage, requisitions, and evictions. People whose homes were destroyed by bombing or seized by German authorities had few options. Homeless populations lived in ruins, makeshift shelters, or moved constantly to avoid German roundups for labor service. The chronic housing shortage created desperation that German authorities could exploit. Sanitation conditions declined as housing became overcrowded and infrastructure deteriorated. Sewage systems failed. Water supplies became contaminated. Diseases associated with poor sanitation, including typhus and dysentery, spread through crowded urban areas. Public health systems in occupied territories lacked resources to respond effectively. The psychological impact of poor housing conditions compounded other stresses of occupation. Overcrowded housing meant no privacy for family life. Shared accommodations with strangers created tension and conflict. Cold, damp, deteriorating housing contributed to depression and despair. Home, which should have been a refuge from occupation, became another site of suffering. Education and indoctrination. Nazi plans for education in occupied territories revealed their long-term goals clearly. Education wasn't about developing human potential. It was about creating a compliant, minimally skilled labor force incapable of intellectual resistance. In territories designated for eventual Germanization, such as parts of Western Europe, education would initially appear relatively normal, but would be fundamentally altered in content and purpose. Schools would remain open, and children would receive basic education. However, curricula would be rewritten to emphasize German language, German history, and Nazi ideology. History lessons would teach that German dominance was natural and inevitable. Literature courses would feature German authors and works that reinforced Nazi values. Science education would include racial biology, presenting Nazi racial theories as scientific fact. Geography would emphasize the German Reich's central position in Europe and its civilizing mission. Foreign language instruction would be eliminated except for German. Native languages would be gradually phased out, first from schools, then from public use, and eventually suppressed entirely. Children would be educated primarily in German, creating a generation unable to communicate effectively with their own grandparents. Teachers who refused to adapt to Nazi curricula would be dismissed. Many of the best educators would be removed, leaving schools staffed by compliant mediocrity or convinced Nazis. The quality of education would decline even as its ideological content intensified. In Eastern territories, education would be far more restricted. Nazi ideology held that Slavic populations needed only minimal literacy and numeracy sufficient for performing agricultural labor and understanding German orders. Higher education would be completely prohibited. Heinrich Himmler stated explicitly that education for Eastern populations should be limited to counting to 500, writing their own names, and understanding that obedience to Germans was a divine commandment. This wasn't hyperbole. This was actual Nazi education policy for territories under permanent occupation. Schools in the East, to the extent they existed, would be primitive. A single teacher for multiple grades. No books beyond basic primers. Instruction focused entirely on practical skills and obedience training. The goal was to produce a population capable of performing manual labor but incapable of independent thought or organization. University education in occupied territories would face severe restrictions. Universities deemed politically unreliable would be closed. Curricula at remaining universities would be purged of content deemed inconsistent with Nazi ideology. Faculty who opposed Nazism would be dismissed or arrested. Students would be subject to political monitoring and indoctrination. Entire fields of study would disappear from occupied territories. Philosophy departments teaching democratic or humanistic principles would be eliminated. Social sciences would be restricted to Nazi-approved theories. The humanities would focus on German culture and Nazi interpretations of history. Independent intellectual inquiry would be impossible. Access to higher education would be restricted by racial and political criteria. Children of known resistors would be barred. Those deemed racially unsuitable wouldn't be permitted university attendance. Even for those allowed to attend, opportunities after graduation would be limited by German control over professional positions. The long-term consequences of this education system would be catastrophic for occupied territories. An entire generation would grow up indoctrinated or deliberately left ignorant. The intellectual and professional classes necessary for advanced societies would be eliminated. scientific research, technological development, and cultural production would atrophy. Youth organizations would supplement formal education with political indoctrination. Nazi youth movements would be established in occupied territories, modeled on the Hitler Youth in Germany. Participation would be mandatory. Activities would focus on physical training, political indoctrination, and preparation for service to the German Reich. These youth organizations would attempt to turn children against their own cultures and even their own families. Children would be encouraged to report parents who expressed anti-German sentiments. Family bonds would be undermined by creating conflicts between indoctrinated youth and their parents who remembered freedom. Work and labor conditions. Daily work life under permanent Nazi occupation would be characterized by coercion, low wages, long hours, and limited rights. The wartime forced labor system provides a template for understanding what working conditions would have been like permanently. For German workers in the Reich, conditions would be relatively favorable compared to occupied populations. Wages would be adequate to maintain living standards. Working hours would be regulated. Safety standards would be enforced. Workers would have some collective representation through the German Labour Front, though it would be a tool of state control rather than genuine worker advocacy. Workers in Western European occupied territories would face significantly worse conditions. Wages would be suppressed by German control over labour markets and competition from forced labour. Many would be conscripted for labour service in Germany or in local industries working for the German war economy, converted to peacetime production for German benefit. Working hours would be long, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 or 7 days per week. Safety conditions would deteriorate as equipment aged without replacement, and supervisors prioritized production over worker welfare. Workplace injuries would be common, and often resulted in dismissal rather than compensation. Workers would have no meaningful right to change employment. Labor allocation would be controlled by German authorities. If you were assigned to a factory, farm, or construction project, you worked there until reassigned. Refusal meant punishment, possibly deportation to labor camps or imprisonment. Eastern European and Soviet workers would face the harshest conditions, essentially slave labor. They would be assigned to agricultural estates, construction projects, or industrial facilities with no choice and minimal compensation. Food would be inadequate, housing would be barracks or worse, and working hours would extend until exhaustion. Mortality rates among Eastern workers would be high. Malnutrition, exhaustion, disease, and workplace accidents would kill significant percentages of the workforce annually. German authorities would view these deaths with indifference. The Eastern territories contained vast populations that could be worked to death and replaced. Agricultural labor in the East would resemble medieval serfdom. Local populations would be bound to German-owned estates, required to perform agricultural work under German supervision. They would receive minimal food and no wages, merely subsistence. Resistance would be met with violence. This system would be chattel slavery in all but name. Construction projects would utilize forced labor on massive scales. The rebuilding of German cities damaged by Allied bombing, the construction of monumental Nazi architecture, and infrastructure projects throughout occupied territories would all be powered by coerced workers. These projects would have high mortality rates, but German planners considered the workers expendable. Women would be exploited both as workers and through reproductive coercion. Women from occupied territories would be conscripted for factory work, domestic service, and agricultural labor. Working conditions would be harsh, and sexual exploitation by German supervisors would be common with no meaningful recourse. Professional workers like doctors, engineers, and teachers would face restricted opportunities. They could only work in positions that served German interests and under German supervision. Professional autonomy would be eliminated. Those who possessed skills Germans needed might be conscripted for specific projects, separated from their families, and relocated as German authorities saw fit. Retirement would be virtually non-existent for occupied populations. People would work until they could no longer perform labor, then would receive no support. The elderly would be dependent on family members who themselves struggled to survive. Life expectancy would decline dramatically due to lifelong malnutrition, hard labor, and lack of support in old age. Culture, entertainment, and propaganda. Cultural life under permanent Nazi occupation would be tightly controlled, with all forms of expression subjected to censorship and manipulation. Nazi authorities understood that controlling culture was essential to controlling populations. Newspapers in occupied territories would be subject to German censorship. All news would be filtered through German propaganda offices. Stories about German achievements would be prominent. Information about resistance activities or German setbacks would be suppressed. International news would be presented from a pro-German perspective. Radio broadcasting would be completely controlled. All radio stations would broadcast German-approved programming. News broadcasts would come from German sources. Entertainment programming would feature German music and German-language content. Radios would be registered, and listening to foreign broadcasts would be criminal offenses punishable by imprisonment. Cinema would become a propaganda tool. Films shown in occupied territories would be German productions or German-approved films from satellite nations. All films would pass through German censors who would prohibit any content suggesting resistance or depicting occupation negatively. Many films would be explicit propaganda glorifying German achievements and Nazi ideology. Newsreels shown before films would present carefully constructed narratives of German success and occupied population contentment. Viewers would see staged scenes of happy workers, productive farms, and grateful populations thanking German authorities for bringing order and civilization. The disconnect between these propaganda images and daily reality would be stark. Theatre would face heavy censorship. Plays critical of authority or celebrating national independence would be prohibited. Classical works might be permitted if they didn't conflict with Nazi ideology, but contemporary playwrights would face strict controls. Theatre would become escapist entertainment or propaganda, nothing more. Music would be subject to ideological control. Jazz, considered racially impure by Nazi ideology, would be banned. Classical music would be permitted, particularly German composers. Folk music celebrating national identity would be suppressed. New composition would have to conform to Nazi aesthetic principles and avoid politically suspect themes. Literature would be heavily censored. Books by banned authors, including most major 20th century works, would be removed from libraries and bookstores. Publishing new works would require German approval. Writers would self-censor to avoid persecution. The result would be literary desert with only propaganda and escapist entertainment available. Art and visual culture would be controlled through similar mechanisms. Modern art movements condemned by Nazis as degenerate would be prohibited. State-approved art would dominate public spaces. Monumental Nazi architecture and sculpture would replace or overshadow local architectural traditions. Visual culture would serve to reinforce German dominance and Nazi ideology. Sports would be permitted but politicized. Athletic competitions would be organized to promote German superiority. German teams would dominate through better nutrition, training facilities, and equipment. Occupied populations would be permitted sports mainly as a safety valve for aggression and frustration that might otherwise be directed at German authorities. Religious worship would continue under restrictions. Churches would remain open but would be monitored by German authorities. Sermons would be reviewed for political content. Clergy who opposed German occupation would be removed. Religious institutions would be pressured to support, or at least not oppose, German rule. Private cultural life would become the only space for authentic expression. In homes, families would maintain prohibited traditions. Banned books would be hidden and read secretly. Prohibited music would be played quietly. Cultural resistance would survive but would be driven underground, always at risk of discovery and punishment. Social control and daily surveillance. Daily life under permanent Nazi occupation would be characterized by constant surveillance and social control mechanisms designed to prevent resistance and ensure compliance. Identity documents would be mandatory. Everyone would be required to carry papers showing their name, nationality, racial classification, and employment status. These papers would need to be produced on demand for German authorities. People without proper documentation would be arrested. Curfews would be enforced in occupied territories. Movement after designated hours would be prohibited. German patrols would arrest anyone found on the streets during curfew. This would restrict social life and make organizing resistance more difficult. Travel restrictions would limit mobility. Moving between districts or regions would require permits from German authorities. These permits would be granted or denied based on German assessment of loyalty and necessity. People would be largely confined to their immediate areas, unable to travel freely even within their own countries. Checkpoints would be established on major roads and at entry points to cities. German security forces would check papers, search vehicles, and interrogate travelers. This would make movement anxiety-inducing and time-consuming. It would also allow German authorities to monitor and control population movements. Informer networks would pervade society. German security services would recruit informers from occupied populations, offering rewards, privileges, or simply threatening punishment for refusal. Neighbors would spy on neighbors. Colleagues would report colleagues. Trust would break down as anyone might be an informer. The psychological impact of surveillance would be profound. People would self-censor constantly, afraid that any critical word might be reported. Conversations would be guarded. Political discussions would occur only with trusted intimates in private settings. The atmosphere would be one of paranoia and fear. Block wardens or street representatives would be appointed in residential areas. These collaborators would monitor their neighbors, report suspicious activities, and ensure compliance with German directives. They would know who lived in each residence, who visited, and what activities occurred. Privacy would be virtually eliminated. Collective punishment would be used to enforce compliance. If resistance activity occurred in an area and perpetrators weren't identified, entire communities might face punishment. Hostages would be taken. Food rations would be reduced. Random arrests might occur. This would pressure communities to police themselves and turn in resistors. Public executions would serve as warnings. Resistors, black market operators, and others who violated German regulations would be publicly hanged or shot. These executions would be announced and sometimes required viewing for local populations. The message would be clear: resistance brings death not just to resistors but potentially to their families. Registration systems would track populations. Everyone would be registered with local authorities. Changes of address, employment, or family status would need to be reported. These registries would allow German authorities to monitor populations, identify individuals for labor conscription, and track potential resistors. Family life and social relationships. Nazi occupation policies profoundly disrupted family life and social relationships in occupied territories. The family, normally a source of stability and support, would become another site of Nazi control and disruption. Family separation was common during the war due to forced labor conscription and would have continued under permanent occupation. Men would be conscripted for labor service and sent to Germany or to projects in occupied territories far from home. Families would be split, often for months or years. Communication would be limited to censored letters. Women left behind would shoulder complete responsibility for families while also facing their own labor conscription. Children would grow up without fathers. The elderly would lack family support. The social fabric of communities would be torn as families fragmented. Marriage would be subject to German regulation. Nazi racial laws would be applied in occupied territories, prohibiting marriages between Germans and non-Germans deemed racially unsuitable. Marriages between different occupied populations might also be restricted based on Nazi racial hierarchies. Personal choice in marriage would be constrained by political and racial considerations. Birth rates in occupied territories would decline due to malnutrition, family separation, and deliberate German population policies. For populations designated for reduction, this would be intentional. For populations deemed suitable for Germanization, German authorities might implement policies to encourage births, including financial incentives or penalties for childlessness. Child rearing would be complicated by conflicting pressures. Parents would want to maintain their own cultural values and national identity. German authorities would insist on indoctrination through schools and youth organizations. Children would be caught between these pressures, sometimes turning against their own parents due to indoctrination. Orphanages would fill with children whose parents died from malnutrition, disease, or German violence. These institutions would be overwhelmed and under-resourced. Children in orphanages would face malnutrition, disease, and often abuse. Some might be selected for Germanization programs if deemed racially suitable. Elder care would become nearly impossible. With family members separated by forced labor and resources scarce, caring for elderly relatives would be extremely difficult. The elderly would be seen as burdens, consuming resources while contributing nothing to German economic interests. Many would die from neglect or deliberate deprivation. Social relationships outside family would be complicated by the informer networks and surveillance. Friendships would be strained by suspicion. Social gatherings would be monitored or prohibited. Community organizations independent of German control would be disbanded. Social isolation would be common as people retreated into tiny circles of trusted relationships. Celebrations and rituals that marked life events would continue, but under constrained circumstances. Weddings would be modest affairs due to food shortages and restrictions on gatherings. Funerals would be simple. Holidays would be observed privately, stripped of public celebration. Life's milestones would be marked, but with the shadow of occupation over everything. Sexual exploitation would be common and systematic. German soldiers and officials in occupied territories would exploit their power to coerce sexual relationships with local women. Resistance would be difficult as women had no meaningful legal recourse, and reporting assault would likely result in punishment of the victim rather than the perpetrator. This would create trauma across occupied societies. Health care and disease. Healthcare systems in occupied territories would deteriorate dramatically under permanent Nazi occupation, creating widespread disease and dramatically reduced life expectancy. Medical resources would be distributed according to Nazi racial hierarchies. Germans would have access to the best medical care, including hospitals, specialists, and medications. Occupied populations would receive minimal health care, often only emergency treatment when workers became unable to work. Hospitals in occupied territories would be under-resourced and overcrowded. Medical supplies would be diverted to Germany or German military use. Medicines would be scarce or unavailable. Equipment would break down and not be replaced. Hospital conditions would decline to levels resembling earlier centuries rather than mid-20th century medicine. Doctors and nurses from occupied territories would face difficult choices. They could collaborate with German authorities, accepting limited resources and German direction over who received care. Or they could resist, operating underground clinics with almost no resources and risking arrest. Many would try to navigate between these extremes, doing what good they could within severe constraints. Infectious diseases would spread due to malnutrition, overcrowding, poor sanitation, and lack of medical care. Tuberculosis, which had been declining in Europe, would surge in occupied territories. Typhus would spread in crowded urban areas and labor camps. Respiratory infections would be common and often fatal for malnourished populations. Childhood diseases would kill at rates not seen in Europe for decades. Measles, whooping cough, and diphtheria would be deadly for malnourished children without access to vaccines or treatment. Infant mortality would rise sharply. Many children who survived would be left with permanent disabilities due to lack of treatment. Chronic diseases would go untreated. Diabetes, heart disease, and cancer would often be death sentences in occupied territories. The medications and treatments that might manage these conditions would be unavailable or reserved for Germans. People would die from conditions that would be survivable with proper medical care. Mental health would deteriorate across occupied populations. Depression would be endemic due to malnutrition, stress, fear, and loss. Suicide rates would increase. Trauma from violence and loss would be widespread. Yet mental health treatment would be virtually non-existent. The concept of mental health care would be a luxury occupied populations couldn't afford. Public health systems would collapse. Vaccination programs would be discontinued. Disease surveillance would be abandoned. Sanitation infrastructure would deteriorate. The public health achievements of the early 20th century would be reversed in occupied territories, though maintained for Germans. Maternal and infant mortality would surge. Pregnant women suffering from malnutrition would face dangerous pregnancies and difficult births. Medical assistance during childbirth would be minimal. Many women would die in childbirth or from complications afterward. Many infants would die in their first year. Disability would become more common and more devastating. Workplace accidents would create disabled workers who would receive no compensation or support. Disease would leave survivors with permanent impairments. Disabled people would be unable to work and would receive no social support. They would be completely dependent on families who themselves struggled to survive. Life expectancy would decline dramatically, particularly in Eastern territories. A person born in occupied Poland or Soviet territories under permanent Nazi rule might expect to live only to their 40s or 50s, assuming they survived childhood. This would be a decline of decades compared to pre-war life expectancy, erasing a century of medical progress. Conclusion. Daily life under permanent Nazi occupation would have been characterized by chronic hunger, deteriorating living conditions, controlled and propagandized culture, constant surveillance, disrupted families, and collapsing healthcare. The experience would vary dramatically based on racial classification and geographic location, but for the vast majority of occupied populations, life would be a daily struggle for survival and maintenance of dignity under oppressive conditions. The wartime experience of occupied territories provides clear evidence of what permanent occupation would have meant. The conditions described here aren't speculation. They're extrapolations from documented conditions that existed during the war and would have continued or intensified under a victory scenario. Perhaps most significantly, these conditions would worsen over time rather than improve. As resources were depleted, infrastructure decayed, and populations were worked to exhaustion, daily life would become increasingly difficult. Younger generations would grow up knowing nothing but occupation, malnourishment, and fear. The psychological damage would be incalculable. Understanding daily life under Nazi occupation makes clear that the stakes of World War II weren't abstract political or military questions. They were about whether millions of people would live lives of dignity and opportunity, or lives of subjugation and suffering. The Allied victory prevented this nightmare of daily oppression from becoming permanent reality. The documents, photographs, and testimonies from occupied territories during the war preserve evidence of what daily life was like under Nazi rule. That this experience was temporary rather than permanent for most of Europe represents one of history's most significant achievements. The alternative would have been generations living and dying under conditions that eroded human dignity and reduced life to mere survival.